Okay, very welcome to the Hub for Politics of the Anthropocene and here, see you. We've started recently and we are kind of developing quite quickly, I hope so. And here you see our postdoctoral researchers and visiting fellows and junior and some students who collaborate with us. And Stefan will tell you about our social media presence. It is highly sophisticated stuff.
It's not. Thank you all for coming to our first seminar. And in order to stay tuned to our next events, our next academic seminars, workshops, and other activities that we're going to do in our research book, you can scan one of the or multiple of our scan codes. QR codes, and stay tuned for more information because there we regularly update our upcoming events and much more things.
So all our events we're trying to advertise them as well as possible on this social media and elsewhere, and also the all hub hybrids, one presence. And hope that our audience is growing. I'm, by the way, I'm Alexander Petkind, director of this hub. And here is Akos Kochan. And Akos is the coordinator of our hub. So today we have extraordinary events, and we are starting the new teaching season with the visit of Helen Thompson from Cambridge University. Professor Thompson teaches political economy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cambridge, and she's a fellow of Clare College. And she has published lots of fascinating stuff on political economy of very different countries and different time periods. It's very historical, also very political. The last book is called Disorder, the World in Hard Times. Is that right?
Hard Times in the 21st Century.
Almost the same thing.
Yeah.
And Helen is also working right now on a kind of long history of England, from being a former colony to being a former empire, all the way to the Brexit. And there are several articles actually on the political economy of Brexit. How it happened, what brought in the UK to Brexit, and what happened after that. And also Professor Thompson is working on European political economy with an emphasis on Germany and also Russia, the origins of German resource dependency, or rather the dependency on Russia. I call it resource dependency by proxy, because it's like the resource dependency through the mediator, who is actually resource dependent. And today, Helen will tell us about most recent discoveries. I've just learned that this disorder book has been just translated into French, and that's actually very interesting. Okay.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you, both because of what you're doing here in this program, and because Vienna is one of my favorite European cities. I like going to talk in Vienna. So what I want to talk about is how to think about the geopolitics of a finite Earth, and to some extent, how to think of the political economy of a finite. I want to make some conceptual remarks to begin with, in terms of the analytical lens that I use for, or come to use anyway, for thinking about these issues. Then I want to say something about the ways in which fossil fuels change the geopolitical world during the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, and why I think that we now live in a world which is trying to come to terms with a set of problems that oil has generated, and that we should see the energy transition in significant part in that context, so not just in relation to climate change. And then I want to say something to finish with about the ways in which the geopolitics and political economy of resource extraction are still going to shape the politics of decarbonised energy in the future, or are already doing so now. So I think it's fair to say, and this seminar is obviously in a way a reflection of that we are living at a time of heightened consciousness about the ecological and material underpinnings of economic modernity. And we're doing so at a time of obvious and deeply worrying geopolitical conflict. And underneath that consciousness, I think, is a lurking suspicion that we have to reckon with a finite Earth, driven perhaps by a fear that a low carbon version of modern industrial civilization for 8 billion people might not be realizable on Earth, at least in the form that we know that modern industrial civilization. I think in one sense, the allure for some of the billionaires, Musk, of space travel to colonize Mars is one manifestation of that consciousness, reflecting the desire quite literally to leave the finitude of life on Earth behind by extending the space in which modern industrial civilization can sustain itself. That's what Bruno Latour named the out of this world option for dealing with the human predicament we now have. From the opposite perspective, finite Earth means for some degrowth and rethinking everything that we know about the place of growth in the ways in which we collectively live. In Latour's terms, that means ecologizing over modernizing. Now, I think what's striking when you turn to politics, the real political world, rather than the way in which we academics try to theorize it, is particularly in Europe, I think, that is a sense, a growing sense of, not that the project of growth, of economic growth, is necessarily over, but that it can no longer be taken for granted as a given. And that in some sense, then that idea of progress, the idea of limitless achievement of human beings has run its course. And I think that if you wanted to think very, very meta way, if you like, we might see underneath some of the political turbulence, particularly in Europe of the last decade or so, some dread of that in some sense, albeit manifesting itself. And actually, you could say this in the United States too, manifesting itself in quite different ways. I think in a way that the energy transition is crucial to that shift. And that's partly because the energy transition and facing up to climate change requires us to reimagine things. But it's also, I think, because underneath the energy transition are some non-climate change reasons for the fact that it is taking place. And that is to do with the dysfunctionalities, the difficulties generated by the present fossil fuel energy system. And in particular, I think it's true to say that the age of cheaply extractable oil, which began the turn of the previous century, so turn of 90, beginning of the 20th century is over. Now, that isn't to say that there won't be times in the future when oil prices might not be particularly low. Think to the way that they crashed in the pandemic, 2020, or the first part of the pandemic. But what it does mean is that those periods of low oil prices will coincide either with exceptionally low general economic demand, i.e. the economic affected partial collapse in 2020, and or that oil production will be unprofitable for commercial producers like the American shale oil companies. So if you go back to the period of oil prices that were very low in 2014, that was brought a great deal of relief to Western economies. But the oil producers, the American shale oil producers that made that possible, were producing at losses, and their losses were effectively propped up by the debt that they were accumulating, the debt those companies were accumulating. And although I think that the problems around oil are more consequential and more formidable, that there are a set of medium-term geopolitical risks around gas that, between them, Russia, Iran, and Qatar, hold about half of the world's known gas reserves. Now, in different ways that the US shale boom and the US shale oil boom and the US shale gas boom have been an amelioration for these problems, but they've also had significant difficulties, and they have a shelf life, which I'm going to come to. Now, I know that I've used the term energy transition, and I know that it's a frequently used term, but I also think that it's a misnomer, and that decarbonisation or net zero, whatever we want to call it, is really an attempted energy revolution in the face of both ecological degradation and in the face of resource depletion. And I think to see what this revolution entails and its dangers, not least in relation to the difficulty of actually achieving it, we need to do some conceptual work about the idea of a finite Earth, and think about some history about, or ways of conceptualizing historically, the relationship between resources, energy, geopolitics, and growth. And I'm going to use a very simple distinction between time and space to make some of the points that I want to hear about why resource extraction is such a fundamental problem for modern politics, whilst making clear that the problem didn't start with modern politics. So let's try and think this through. How can we think about resource extraction as posing a temporal problem? So in time, some of the Earth's resources, those extracted from under the Earth's land or under the ocean, become depleted, and they cannot be recreated in time, like trees can grow again, or soil can be replenished. Now, this isn't a straightforward question about depletion, because the moments when the depletion causes problems depend on the economic viability of extracting the depleting resource. So there is no point, if you want to put it into oil terms, when the world's actually going to run out of oil, but there will be some point when the economics of extracting that oil and the energy required, crucially, to extract that oil mean that it's a pointless exercise, and oil could not be used as the basis of an energy regime anymore. Spatially, the geographical distribution of these resources is fixed. That's again seems a simple point, but it involves recognizing that human beings have absolutely no agency over where that they are located. And this issue interacts with geopolitics, because it's not just a matter of where the resources are, but who has the power to extract them. And I just want to bring out one thing here, which I think is important in terms of understanding why resource extraction is such a huge deal for the way in which we can conceive modern political possibilities. And that is, modern civilization has depended thus far on a fossil fuel energy regime. It yielded this idea of progress and of human progress, but actually was dependent upon something over which human beings had no influence whatsoever. In fact, something that appeared fossil fuels or created millions of years before there was humans on this planet. And there's a kind of like paradox there that I don't think that that in lots of ways, we as humans in a way have got our minds, or we as humans in the West perhaps have got our minds around. Now, if we go back like historically in human time now, civilizations have always had to grapple with both the temporal and the spatial parts of resource extraction on a finite Earth. But prior to modern industrial civilization, they had done so primarily in relation to metals and not in relation to fossil fuels. So it was using fossil fuels for mechanical energy and heat energy on a large scale. Only really England, go back to the point I was saying to Alexandria earlier, had actually started using a fossil fuel for heat energy relatively early. But using fossil fuels for mechanical energy with the Industrial Revolution transformed the human relationship to a finite Earth, and it made it possible for the Earth to support a much bigger population, human population, than it had ever been able to do so. But in a way, not actually in a way, it simply did. It condemned human beings to a permanent search of the Earth for these energy resources that would become more difficult as those on land and closest to the Earth's surface were used. And the spatial search for those resources came particularly when fossil fuels moved in their emphasis from coal to oil, in my view, completely to shape geopolitically the history of the 20th century. So let's have a look then about how fossil fuels changed the geopolitical world. Coal was initially difficult to transport by sea because of its weight. So advantages went to those who had a domestic supply, could extract it cheaply, transport it internally in a commercially viable way. So I know that this is a simple comparison, but I think it makes the point clearly. Let's take Britain and China. I think if anybody had said in the 17th century, Britain, that didn't even exist at the time, it was England, was going to become the world's most powerful state with this largest empire in human history, and the economic prowess that it had, it would have seemed absurd. To the contrary, China was the most economically developed, technologically sophisticated country, still probably was by the beginning of the 19th century. Now, there's obviously lots of things that can be said about why things turned out in the way in which that they did, but one of them is that Britain had coal deposits next to iron deposits, and they were around towns. It was relatively straightforward for Britain to start using coal for mechanical energy to industrialize. China had plenty of coal, but its deposits were many landlocked miles away from its core regions before railways. And so no matter what breakthroughs had occurred in terms of extraction, there was much less incentive for China to use coal to achieve an industrial revolution. If you then look at how the geopolitics of the world changed in the 19th century, one crucial turning point the opening up of China to European influence, which came with Britain's success in the First Opium War. Britain then used coal-fired um, steamships to open China up and to inflict that defeat on China. So you don't have Britain as a imperial power in search of resources. It had them, and then it used the military power that came from that decisively to change the relationship between Europe and Asia. Oil, though, was a very different proposition for European countries. Europe, with the exception actually of Austria, confronted a huge spatial problem when oil became a significant energy source, and it did primarily in the first instance for military purposes. The most concentrated reserves in Eurasia were in Russia, itself a great power, and then at the start of the 20th century it became clear that they were in a place, the Middle East, Persia and the Ottoman Empire, where the European imperial influence had not penetrated in the same way. The other part of the world where oil production was strong and growing in the first part of the 20th century was the Western Hemisphere, the United States in particular, but by the time the First World War started, also Mexico. And I don't think it's possible to understand the conflicts of the First World War without understanding its oil outcomes and the fact that American oil made it possible for Britain and France to prevail over Germany. And if we look at it in terms of the outcomes, what we can see is that the British held on to their position in Persia, their sphere of influence in Persia. They established effective control over Mesopotamia, so present-day Iraq. And in the fight for Baku, which is the center of the Russian oil industry, most of the players made a play for Baku, Britain, the Ottomans, but the Soviets, having lost it, controlled it by the early 1920s. So the big geopolitical loser in Europe in the beginning of the age of oil was Germany. Germany constantly had to look for technological remedies. In the Weimar era, it began to produce synthetic fuel, so using coal, the energy resource which Germany did have in abundance, and turn it into a substitute for oil. And in that sense, I think it's fair to say that the German case showed, and you can see this actually in relation to artificial nitrogen as well, is that it was possible in principle to find economic and technological ways out of the spatial constraints created by resource extraction. But obviously under the Nazis, then the turn was not to, well, the Nazis didn't repudiate the technological turn, but they decided it was insufficient. They moved into catastrophic territorial conquest in Europe and Russia itself, and annihilating, a purposeful annihilation of the populations that were already dependent upon those resources. And that's the catastrophe, the final catastrophe of Europe's history in the first half of the 20th century, as the European states tried to get to grips with the limited, as it still then was, energy transition from coal to oil. The United States, by contrast, though, had a temporal problem and not a spatial problem, because it did have a significant domestic supply. In fact, it had a large scale domestic supply when you look at it as a whole over the whole of the first 2/3 of the 20th century. But the constant fear in America was that the oil would run out. where was the next oil in the United States coming from? If you then look at American policy in the post-Second World War world, what you can see is that, aware of that temporal problem facing the United States, i.e. when was American oil production going to peak? The answer, it turned out to be, was going to be like 1970, before shale came along. And so their view was, American presidents, American politicians, American political classes view was, well, we need the oil of the Western Hemisphere for ourselves. And so what the Europeans are going to do, or the West Europeans are going to do in the post-Second World War world, obviously they're not going to go back to conquering each other, trying to conquer each other for control of what little resources there are in Europe. They're going to become dependent on the Middle East. Given the fact that the Cold War came quite quickly after 1945, the Americans also insisted by 1949 they didn't want the West Europeans going back to having a trade with the Soviet Union. And what you can see in terms of the problems that European countries faced by the middle of the 1950s, and in the case of West Germany, this would become the origins of its decades-long energy relationship with the Soviet Union / Russia that was so complicated and compromised by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It came as a response to this essential problem of, what do you do if you're a West European country and the age of empire is coming to an end? Even the British in the Middle East are struggling by the middle of the 1950s. And the Americans are not keen for the American companies to sell you oil. You can pick your poison, so to speak, between the Soviet Union, which at different points the Americans might stop you trying to do, or dependency upon the Middle East. Now, if we then turn to the end of the 60s and the early 1970s, we can see that the spatial problem for the Europeans and the temporal problem for the Americans crashed into each other, because 1970, as I said, was the year that American oil production peaked. America very rapidly in the 1970s moved to becoming the largest oil importer in the world. So having now the European spatial problem. And meanwhile, the Middle East, on which the Europeans had depended, became incredibly more difficult. The British were pushed out of their last position in the Middle East in 1967, came in the aftermath of the Egyptians shutting the Suez Canal for 8 years. And it came in a context in which nationalism, energy nationalism against not just European imperial control in the past in the Middle East, but the presence of international oil companies, including American companies, produced sufficient backlash that the Arab states wanted to control oil industries for themselves. So we've got state-owned companies controlling most of the reserves of oil in the Middle East by the end of the 1970s. And just to compound all that, the Bretton Woods monetary system that had been set up in 1944 had been premised on the fact that the United States was not going to be a significant oil importer, that the United States was going to have a trade surplus. But once the United States is on that trajectory to becoming the largest oil importer in the world, then the premise of that monetary system falls away. And put all that together, and you've got, I think, a reasonably clear explanation as to why the 1970s is as difficult it is for Western economies. If we then, though, say, well, lots of the fears in a way that were articulated about growth in the 1970s, think of the limits to growth report by the Club of Rome, didn't materialize. One of the reasons why that is the case is that there turned out to be a way out of the energy crisis of the 1970s that came, if you like, spatially. It came from offshore oil production, and very helpfully for Western countries, most of that offshore production in the 70s took place in three places: Alaska, the North Sea, and Mexico. That was a lot better as a spatial solution for importing oil than from the Soviet Union or from the Middle East. And I think that it's fair to say that the economic years from you can argue about when it starts, but let's just say from like about 1983, 1984 onwards through the next 20 years, the time that came to be called the Great Moderation by the American Federal Reserve Chair, Alan Greenspan, what the Bank of England Chair in 2005 described as the years of nice, non-inflationary continuous economic growth, was an era in which there were low oil prices. Now, the only reason why they were able to have offshore oil production that could produce low oil prices was those high oil prices in the 1970s. And we're beginning to see the difficulty that oil generates here once you get into having to extract more difficult and more costly resources. But nonetheless, the net effect of it, once the crisis, the 70s and the early 80s had played out, was a relatively, for Western countries, relatively benign set of international economic conditions. Now, into this, though, came something that would change, in a way, would change everything, and that was China. And it's interesting that actually, if you go back to the early 1970s, so when the Americans were most really disturbed about what the future would hold for them economically in light of the end of American relative self-sufficiency in oil, a lot of hope was actually placed in China. I actually come into the conclusion that you can't really understand why the Nixon administration pursued the China policy in which it did, i.e. the opening to China, without seeing that there was quite a lot of people in that administration and the American energy industry that saw offshore in China as the big new oil hope. It turned out like not to be the case. And the fact that it turned out not to be the case has had a set of consequences, one of which is that China became itself an oil importer sooner than the Chinese leadership would have liked. It became a net importer of oil in 1993. Now, China is the largest oil importer in the world. So if you look at that period when China's economic growth was really taking off, so from the years after it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, what you can see is that its demand for oil like surges. And it happens to surge at pretty much the same time that benefit from the offshore fields that come on in the 80s is starting to wear off. So what you can see by 2005, and you can see it pretty clearly that it happens in 2005, is that there's a stagnation of crude oil production in the world as the larger oil fields aged. There's a set of geopolitical problems in a number of oil producing countries, making the problem worse. And it leads to really, by the middle of 2008, an enormous rise in oil prices. So oil prices in the middle of 2008 in the terms of that year's value, I'm not adjusting this, were about $115 a barrel, the highest that they've ever been by far, comes out of this clash, or the conjunction would be a better way of putting it, of rising Asian demand driven by China and stagnant production. And it's no coincidence that that phrase that Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England at the time, used in he coined in a speech that he gave in 2005, and he said that nice is over because oil is going to become more expensive, and we can already see what's happening here. Now, this is where we get on to the question of oil wars. And I don't think it's possible to understand the Iraq war without putting it in the context of what was happening in those years between 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, and 2005, when oil production stagnated. Now, Bush administration, the George Bush Jr. administration, when it came in, immediately commissioned, or immediately had the Vice President, Dick Cheney, produce a report on the problems facing the American economy in relation to oil. And the conclusion that it drew by a number of conclusions, but one of the conclusions that it drew was that it was a big problem having the world's largest oil producing region, the Middle East. You had North Africa in, it would have been 3 countries, with 2 of them in the Middle East and 1 in North Africa, Libya. So Iran and Iraq, Libya and North Africa under sanctions, because you're looking at the prospect of stagnant oil production that they could foresee. And actually you're making that, your own policies are making that outcome happen, because you're restricting the amount of oil, not only that they could export, but in practice what that they could produce too. So it's pretty clear that the Bush administration hoped to bring to an end the military containment regime in Iraq against Saddam Hussein and get the oil majors, the Western oil majors, back into Iraq. Remember that they've been banished since the 1970s in the rest of the Middle East, turn Iraq into a large-scale oil producer. And by that means something that was comparable to Russia's output and Saudi Arabia output. Remember, this is shown. I think it's also significant that we can see that the ways in which the war divided Europe at the time, divided the European Union, went around energy orientation. So Germany and France, which had stronger energy relationship with Russia, willing to side effectively with Putin in opposition to the war. Britain, much more historically involved in the Middle East, still more dependent upon Middle Eastern imports, even though it was had North Sea was declining by that point, went with the United States. Now, what we know is obviously that in terms of its oil objectives, the war failed. Is the most I think that Iraq has ever managed to produce is 4.9 million barrels a day, and the hope was it's going to be producing 12 million barrels a day. And to the extent that it is true that the Western oil companies got back into Iraq, they had to share the spoils of war with Chinese companies. And actually, if you look at who's been staying and who's been leaving Iraq in the last few years, the answer is the Chinese companies are staying and the Western oil companies are leaving. So if there was an oil benefit to the Iraq war, it turned out not to be for the United States. And in this sense, I think shale, the American shale oil boom, actually proved to be the compensation for the fact that in oil terms, the Iraq war failed. Because the reason why, despite the fact that there's not really been any meaningful increase in conventional oil production since that 2005 stagnation, that the world economy didn't have a crisis in the 2010s as a consequence of that, is because America went back to being a large-scale oil producer. So instead of there being three, it being Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Russia, it became Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States. Now, there's a lot I could say about what the geopolitical fallout in terms of the US position in the Middle East and Saudi relationship, maybe for another time. But there's something else that I want to bring in here, because it pertains to Ukraine, which I want to talk about as well in relation to metals in a moment. But I think that perhaps the metal dimension of the Ukraine conflict is better understood than the shale gas, or the role that shale gas played in the early when the conflicts in the last decade, in the 2010s. So the US shale oil boom was very disruptive in the Middle East. The US shale gas boom was geopolitically pretty disruptive in Europe. One way of thinking about this is, at the beginning of the 20th century, American and Russian oil companies competed for the European market for oil. In the 2010s, the US shale gas boom, allied to the new market for liquid natural gas, so using the seas for gas trade, meant that American companies and Gazprom could compete for the European market at a time, obviously, when many European countries had an entrenched relationship with Russia, not just Germany, but Italy too. But what's also true is, in the early 2010s, that there was a great deal of hope, encouraged by the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State in particular, for European shale. And the two places that were considered prime territory for the development of European shale were Poland and Ukraine. And what's interesting here is that if you go back to that period between 2010 and 2014, so the years of Yanukovych, the person who's usually seen as the pro-Russian president of Ukraine at that time, what he's actually doing where energy is concerned is trying to use shale to get Ukraine a European future. So he says in August 2010, Ukraine's future belongs in Europe, and we're going to achieve that by developing our resources. And he means by that shale gas. In 2013, his government made an agreement with Shell for permit for shale gas exploration in a field in the Donetsk Oblast and in the Kharkiv Oblast. They made one with Chevron in Western Ukraine. The willingness of the Yanukovych government to deal with the Western energy companies about shale meant that they were also willing to deal with him about oil. So Shell, then Royal Dutch Shell, and ExxonMobil struck an agreement for offshore oil exploration in the Black Sea, in Ukrainian waters. But what's the truth? What then happened was the 2014 crisis brought all this to an end. So Shell pulled out in 2015 because of the conflict in the Donbass. The Black Sea exploration ended with Russian annexation of Crimea. Interestingly, Chevron pulled out too, even though they were in Western Ukraine, unaffected either by what was going on in the Black Sea or what was going on in the Donbass. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. I mean, I think one way of looking at it is to say that this was a bit illusory, even though it caused this conflict, or it caused the conflict. It intensified the conflict, particularly in the Donbass in that period, and that was because the results of the shale gas exploration in Poland, which had gone much further, turned out not to be very encouraging. And so many in the industry came to the view that European shale was just not going to deliver. The rocks would not fracture in the same way in this continent as they do in the United States. That is definitely part, I think, of why Chevron pulled out. But I think it's also clear that what we can see here is that the willingness of the Western companies to engage in energy exploration in Ukraine is part of the context in which Putin thought that he needed to make moves to make that more difficult, not least in the Black Sea. And that when we can then see, as I'm going to come to in a moment, that Ukraine then matters, Ukraine's resources matter in the war, that we might think of the Ukraine conflict as having a long resourced history to it. What then about the energy transition itself as a way out of the spatial and temporal limits of fossil fuel energy extraction that have been evident since the first decade of this century? I think that what we can all understand is that decarbonized energy puts the burden of resource extraction onto metals. In a world in which we got somewhere near net zero, much less resource extraction would go on the extraction of energy itself. What we would need and do need is metals, both for the construction of decarbonized energy infrastructure, but also crucially for batteries. I think that, again, if we think about it, we can see, sort of like from a long, historical perspective, and indeed from a scientific perspective in this respect, is that this is not as difficult a problem as fossil fuel energy extraction is. One very simple reason is that metals can be reused and energy can't. And that's what I meant when I said that when human beings move to using fossil fuel energy, they condemned us all to a permanent search of an endless permanent search of the world's surfaces and seas for that energy. Once we were on that, that's what we had to continue doing. It's also, I think, quite likely, and we will begin to see some of it, that technological innovation will make it possible to substitute the metals in ways of which, if you wanted to have a point of comparison, that are more like the German technological solution to its spatial energy problems at the beginning of the 20th century. Again, you can't do that with actual energy itself. It can't be created or destroyed. There's no substitute for it. Nonetheless, I think it's clear that already that the magnitude of the energy revolution, or the attempted energy revolution, means a vast amount of metals have to be extracted before they can then start to be recycled. And metal extraction poses significant geopolitical and domestic political difficulties. It's very notable that thus far, there's a much greater concentration of the mining of metals in a few particular places than there has been of fossil fuels, at least since that sort of 10-year period at the beginning of the 20th century, when it wasn't much more than the United States and Russia. So we just take two different examples now. 70% of cobalt production is in the Congo. 70% of rare earth production is in China. Nowhere near, no Saudi Arabia, Russia, United States get nowhere near these proportions when it comes to supply of oil or gas. It's also clear though that this concentration is far from a function of geography, or it's far from just a function like of geography. Actually, metals are probably not more evenly, that's going a little bit too far, but somewhat less arbitrarily, let's put it that way, distributed across the earth than fossil fuel energy is. One of the reasons why, particularly where rare earths is concerned, is that it's so concentrated in China, is because quite literally the Americans that totally dominated rare earths production in the latter part of the 50s and the early 60s through to the 90s decided to offshore it. So there's something, now you get, go back to that, I think it's 2011, the US Congress in a complete panic after China unofficially, but in practice did, embargo the export of rare earths to Japan. Complete panic in Washington, congressional report, what on earth we're going to do about this? China can use this as a geopolitical weapon. The only reason why it was there in China was because the Americans didn't want to carry on in California. Mount Pass is where it was being done, partly for environmental reasons and partly for labor reasons. And it's interesting now that you can see that there's quite a backlash in China against the rare earths concentration. The health hazards of rare earth mining, the part of China which is near Mongolia, occurs are very acute. That China itself now wants offshoring rare earths. It's been looking to Greenland, it's been looking to the moon, the place, and you can understand the logic of if there's something that this is dangerous, that this needs, let's put it on the moon. I think as well we can see this is a function of the interaction between the geopolitics of who economically gets to control the mining and where the mining occurs, that there is a domestic politics that will have to be taken really seriously in terms of being able to do mining on any kind of politically sustainable basis. And we can see it already in action in Latin America, where there are a significant amount of the world's lithium production presently takes place, but we can also see it in the one European country. Well, actually, no, that's not true. In the second European country that's going down the road to significant scale lithium mining, that's already there in Portugal, in Serbia. The EU agreed a strategic partnership with Serbia about raw materials, so I'm sure some of you know, I think it was in July. Large scale protests. And if we think about this historically, you can say that it took, you can argue about whether it took 50 years in the Middle East from the point when oil was discovered in Persia for oil nationalism really to be a factor. It's certainly there by the time that British and Americans were engaging in a coup against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. It really started to shape the politics of oil in the Middle East from 1967 onwards, from the point in which NASA closed the Suez Canal. You can argue perhaps that it started immediately or relatively quickly in Mexico, and that it played some part in the context of the Mexican revolution. But generally, there was a period of time in which that there was what's way of putting this, that it was possible for both European powers and international oil companies to act in imperial ways without meeting much domestic resistance, or at least without meeting domestic resistance that would really stop them doing what they were trying to do. That's not going to happen this time around. Particularly for Europe, I think, when you look at some of the parts of the world which Europeans are going to want to supply Europe with metals for the energy transition, are parts of the world which have already had a colonial experience of Europeans. If we look at then at Ukraine in this context, the Ukraine war in this context, I think it's fair to say that it's become increasingly clear that metals have been part of the Ukraine war. The two crucial metals that are in Ukraine are titanium, used in advanced military equipment, including warships and long-range missiles, and lithium, which is the single most important metal probably for the energy transition. The Russian army sees at least 2 titanium ore sites in the first part of the war. There are believed to be 4 significant lithium deposits in Ukraine. 2 of them are in clear Russian controlled territory at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that the parties to the war have been highly conscious of what's at stake in metal terms since the beginning. Indeed, if you go to July 2021, so 6 months before the invasion, the EU and Ukraine signed a strategic partnership on raw materials. The Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, every time he opens his mouth now on the subject of war, you can hear him say, and they've got lots and lots of metals that we need to make us prosperous, and we can't possibly give in. Now, I think that it's also clear one of the reasons why Ukraine hasn't had a significant mining industry in the past is because some of these metals are going to be pretty costly to extract in Ukraine. The conditions are not that great, and some of them are quite deep under the Earth's surface. So it's possible that this could be a conflict a bit like over the shale gas, where perhaps the prospects are not as good as that they seem. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear that the spatial distribution of these metals in Ukraine poses a really complex set of issues for any future partition of Ukraine to end the war, and particularly in relation then to the ethnic composition of the populations around these metal-rich areas. So, to finish, I think it's fair to say that as human beings on Earth, moving out from Europe, that humankind is in an entirely unprecedented historical situation. If civilizations have always grappled with temporal and spatial limits around resource extraction, our civilization is genuinely different because of the immensity of the problem on each side and the fact that we're still dealing with fossil fuel energy resource extraction at the same time as trying to move to much more metal-centered resource extraction to try to decarbonize. And again, I'll just here think Latour has got a very acute point. He says no human society has had to grapple with the reactions of the Earth system to the actions of 8 or 9 billion humans. All the wisdom accumulated over 10,000 years, even if we were to succeed in rediscovering it, has never served more than a few hundred, a few thousand, a few million human beings on a relatively stable stage. And the energy transition then, I think, has in part got to be a bet on technological innovation to try and solve some of these problems without resource extraction, or at least to reduce the scale of the resource extraction that's presently required on the metal front. I think for European countries, an absence of growth, or at least the real possibility of let's call it economic stagnation, has got a real possibility of becoming the norm. Not that we then are pursuing degrowth, but that we end up, if you like, with post-growth, because the spatial problem that Europeans face, a weak energy and metal base, not having any possibility of going back to its historical solutions, which have been empire, and having what is in part a resource conflict war on its borders. That, I think, once we look at it in those terms, is really quite an immense problem that Europe faces. And I think that we, thinking about these issues both as scholars and as citizens, need to get more politically and more intellectually serious, which is obviously what you're doing in this program, about what it means for human beings under modern conditions to live with the demand of resource extraction, because we can't actually escape from resource extraction. We might be able to mitigate it, but we have to face it and find ways through it that are survivable, to put it very simply.
Thank you very much. It was like a guided tour, like across the planet. Looking for survival, I think. And so questions and comments, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yulia Pavlovska. I'm a bachelor's student here doing philosophy, politics, and economics. And I wanted to, before I put forward my question, I just wanted to thank the center for this amazing presentation and Dr. Helen Thompson. It was very engaging and very interesting. And I wanted to ask, because you gave a very interesting perspective on the how the war in Ukraine has affected the international energy balance. So I wanted to ask, what do you think, what effect do you think the conflict in the Middle East will have on this energy balance? So what is happening now?
I think that in one way, what's historically notable is how limited the fallout from the Middle East conflict in energy terms has been so far. If you go back like to the 1970s, in fact, if you go back to all the wars that have involved Israel and Arab states, and I know it's not quite right to say that this is between Israel and Arab state, who Israel is fighting, Hamas is Iran. Leave that question aside, but let's just say then the military conflicts which Israel has been involved in, beyond the first one in 1956, Syria's huge problem for not just for Britain, but for France and West Germany. Indeed, Conrad Adenauer flew to Paris in the middle of that crisis and told the French Prime Minister that Europe would be his revenge for what had happened over Suez. 1967, the conflict then, as I said, that led to closure of the Suez Canal for 8 years. Big problem for Western European countries. The best known Yom Kippur War of like 1973, oil embargoes, increased oil prices. This one hasn't registered in the way in which those done. Part of the explanation of that is that Israel itself is in a different energy position than it was, not just because it now has its principal exportable to it. Azerbaijan, and second, so not either Iran or not Iran, which was the one that was playing it in the 70s, and Israel itself is a gas exporter, and Egypt and Lebanon are countries that are somewhat at least dependent upon Israel. So Israel being significantly less vulnerable than it was helps other countries, other Western countries, in terms of protecting themselves from the fallout. What I would say, though, is that the potential for significant disruption is still very much there. And the place where you can see it thus far in a moderate level is the Houthis effectively closing the Red Sea, and with that the Suez Canal to Western shipping, which has some consequence for liquid natural gas. The thing that would really change everything in energy terms would be if the Houthis went back to attacking in the Persian Gulf. And interestingly, they were attacking Saudi Arabia on the Persian Gulf side, and Saudi Arabia was fighting the war in Yemen. Very big attack in 2019 on a Saudi oil processing facility. But thus far, the Houthis have concentrated on the Red Sea and not on the Persian Gulf. But that's the place where there's most likely, or not most likely, that's the wrong way of putting it, where there's still high stakes for fallout from the Middle East.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I am really grateful for the talk. My name's Hannah. I'm an Erasmus student. I actually go to the Hertie School in Berlin, but I'm Canadian, and I did my undergrad in Canada, where I studied forestry as well as politics. So I'm super interested in, I guess, resource conflict and resource scarcity. And Canada is also like a huge producer of oil and gas, and I think our main partner whom we export to right now is the US. And I'm also really interested in the Arctic. And you mentioned it briefly in terms of like offshore oil that's being drilled for in Alaska. And I know Canada also is sort of very interested, especially because we're not super well positioned in sort of the face of, I guess, the green energy transition in sort of broad terms. And I'm wondering about sort of your thoughts on, obviously, with the claims to the Arctic, and I believe it's Norway that is like one of the highest producers of oil in Western Europe, and sort of how, like, with the melting of like the Arctic ice sheet, how that will, I guess, play into this whole European attempt to transition and sort of move to transition, as obviously more seas exposed, and like the opportunity for a lot of companies and countries to drill, sort of, it's like burning the candle at two ends, but how that sort of presents.
I mean, I think that the Arctic is like really become a really important site of geopolitical tension for these energy reasons. You can see it like in a number of respects. You can see it in Greenland. It's not just obviously the Chinese who've been interested in Greenland. If you go back to that seemingly random moment when Donald Trump, when he was still president, was saying he wanted to buy Greenland from the United States, that's what that was ultimately about. You can see it in terms of the seas as well. And I think you can say that one of the effects of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has actually been to weaken Russia's position in the Arctic. Russia been quite assertive about the Arctic from about 2007 onwards, and being it like our resources. There's a sort of complicated like set of treaties around certain aspects of the Arctic, and the fact that Norway, the fact that Sweden and Finland have ended up joining NATO, and the fact that the Arctic Council was suspended in the early part of the war because of Russian action, I think has shown how you get spillover from even something going on around the Black Sea, essentially, to the waters of the Arctic, because it brings together Russia's energy ambitions in different ways and Russia's geopolitical power. But it's also the case that the melting of the ice in the Arctic has made it possible for there to be transit through the Arctic during the winter months, and the Great North Sea route is a competitor now in terms of trade between Northern Europe and China, with the old route going through Suez Canal. And in the context of which Suez Canal has also been subject to conflict this year, that is like a major deal, and it's particularly a major deal for China, because in a world in which China carries on importing oil from Russia, which is still new, and that oil is not coming out through Black Sea down to the Mediterranean, that's cutting out completely by going over the top, so to speak, is a world that is much harder for the United States to blockade China's energy supply and any confrontation over Taiwan than the world in which we presently are. And you can see a significant increase in Russia-China trade on that sea route since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think that the Arctic is going to be a really big part of geopolitics over the next 20 years or so.
Professor Thompson, thank you very much for your presentation. If you were to discuss not the geopolitics of finite Earth, but maybe geopolitics of infinite sun, would you be optimistic or pessimistic about that? And do you think that we already see any geopolitical developments related to the transition, especially now? I think we are on the verge of solving maybe the problem with the storage of solar energy. So what do you think about it?
I mean, I think that there are some reasons for like optimism about this, and there are other reasons for like pessimism about it. I mean, it seems to me that like on the storage breakthroughs, that it is possible. California is like a good example where storage can be used really to not quite like eliminate the intermittency problem with solar and wind generated electricity, but much to reduce it. Whether we've got technological breakthroughs that will help with the storage problems facing North European countries in particular, I think that's I don't think those technological breakthroughs there, because of the length of time that you need the storage for, the volume that you do is considerably greater. I think that the thing to be optimistic about, as I say, is although the infinite sun does not escape the finite metal, because everything that you're doing requires a method for solar-based electricity, and then electrification requires a metal base. The demands of it are not, as I say, I think, as destructive as using actually extraction to get the energy itself. I think, though, that if we look at the problem as how fast are we, particularly in Europe, decarbonising electricity, we look like we are getting closer to using the sun and the wind to deal with these problems, leaving the metal aside. When you look at it as though, how fast are we decarbonising our overall energy and reducing the amount of fossil fuel energy that we're using, it doesn't look like we made that much progress at all. And I think that's partly where the difficulty that European politicians, and you can see this in the UK very much, particularly under the new government, have like got into in talking about the issue, in the sense of it's two things that we have to do. We have to decarbonise electricity, and then we have to take all those things where we've used fossil fuels and electrify them. And the first part is the relatively easy part. The second part is the exceptionally difficult part. And it's quite hard to find clear cases of countries that have really made progress, significant progress, I think, on the second, where it's relatively easy to find countries that have made excellent progress, like Denmark, let's say, on the first.
Thank you very much. My name is Imre Szabó, and I'm a visiting lecturer here at the Political Science and International Relations Department. And my question would be probably a follow-up on the previous one in terms of should we conceive these energy constraints as hard constraints, or does it rather depend on the production regime, for example? So the how efficient production is in certain countries. And this came to my mind because you mentioned that the way out of the crisis of the 70s was through offshore production and spatial fixed, basically, so exploring new resources. But I think there could be an alternative explanation, and that goes back to changing production and the spread of lean production and more efficient, more energy efficient production. So would there be a way out in terms of changing production regime rather than going for new energy sources?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think those things are like binaries or either ors. I think that if you go back to like the 70s comparison, what is certainly true is that it was possible to achieve significant energy efficiencies that nobody particularly had looked for in some cases before, which you might say in the European case is like very surprising, given how fundamentally difficult oil was as an energy source for European countries. I mean, it was once you get past 1945, or certainly when you get into the 50s, when oil is central to the domestic economy and cars, mass ownership like of cars, you would have thought that the incentive for energy efficiency where oil concerned were overwhelming, given it was just a perpetual problem for West European countries. But it actually took the energy crisis of the 70s really for that energy efficiency drive like to take place. Nonetheless, and I should say, I think you can see that it made a difference. Nonetheless, if you look at it in terms of the world as a whole, and you think that in the 70s we were embarking upon that story where China was going to become integrated into the world economy, and at a certain point China was going to stop being energy relatively self-sufficient, it's quite difficult to see how the way out of the 70s didn't involve
Thank you.
Yeah, Michael Stewart, I'm an anthropologist on the sabbatical year here in the nationalism programme. I just wanted to ask you whether you see any role for nuclear in decarbonising. And I mean, obviously there are inefficiencies if you do it, you're just stuck in France and you don't renew. But if you go global, and of course there's a limited amount of nuclear fuel, but over the next 50, 100 years, is there a role for that? You think, or is it conceivable that people will shift? I mean, perhaps not in this part of the world, but in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at Asia, the nuclear power is absolutely, it's going to be part of the future. And you look in Asian countries, and they seem to have much less difficulty getting nuclear reactors built than we do in the West. I think I'm right in saying that there's, in the last 20 years of this century, I think there's been one entirely new reactor that's been built in the United States. So I'm not an anti-nuclear person. I think though what we should bear in mind is that nuclear power as a alternative for Europe to fossil fuel energy has been a dream since before I was born, since the mid-1950s. It was a part of the whole creation of the European Union in the European Atomic Energy Community. And if you go back to the speeches that have been given by the president of the European Atomic Energy Community then, it's the same language that European leaders are using now about alternative energy and being nuclear power, now being solar, like wind generated electricity, allowing Europe to free itself from foreign resource dependency. Problem is it's almost exactly like the same language. And first of all, one of the reasons why that isn't the case, didn't materialize, is because you still had to have, as you've already suggested, like a supply of uranium. French were could take, shall we say, some benefit from their empire, you know, like in that respect. The Germans found that they still, you know, had a problem, and when they were then importing enriched uranium from the United States, Carter administration stopped the export of enriched uranium in the United States, like in the 1970s, and off they have to go to Russia. So the Union, like as it then was. So it's still, from a European point of view, got a foreign resource dependency problem. And even if we're sort of ignore the cost issue, it's also the case that it's only a solution so far as electrification takes place. So it will help any state, I think, in decarbonising its electricity, but it won't change the overall use of fossil fuels unless electricity starts replacing oil, particularly in transportation and gas and in heating and industrial production.
My name is David. Didn't study here. I don't study here, but thank you for opening this to the public. I just wanted to mention that I find like two of the questions related to if we must change the energy sources and if somebody could drill oil in the Arctic are quite naive in the sense that I think it must be clear that fossil fuels are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. So 80% come from fossil fuel, and also even all countries agreed last year to phase down fossil fuels at the conference, climate conference. So I would rather think like what really stands in the way of the energy transition or of decarbonization. I don't think it is like the technical side. I rather side with people who say it's like the political will, and I would like to know if you have any views on this. If there's like a political will, if there's like a capture of government by the fossil fuel industry, or if those concepts are too.
I think if you're talking about the United States, there is, in fact, if you're talking about Australia, the United States, and Canada, essentially the countries, Western countries that are significant exporters of at least one fossil fuel, in the United States, both gas and oil, there is a politics around not just energy, but around climate change that is influenced by that. And you can clearly see it playing out in the present American presidential election, is that from the point of view of Trump and many others in the Republican Party, the United States has energy options because it's an energy superpower in their minds. I don't think that's quite right, but that's another matter. And it doesn't have to go any faster with the energy transition that suits its overall energy interests. And Paris's position is climate change reasons need to go as fast as like possible. You don't get that in European countries' politics in anything like the same way. Perhaps Norway might be something of a different case, because the countries that have been significant fossil fuel producers and exporters, like the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, North Sea oil is well on its decline. That doesn't mean, though, I think that why European countries haven't gone quicker than they have done with the energy transition is a function of their poor political will to do the energy transition. It's difficult, and it's difficult still for some technological reasons to do with storage, where solar and wind generated electricity is concerned. And it's difficult because if you just like take like electric vehicles, like for example, is that there just is not yet the market for buying them in a way that's comparable for internal combustion engine vehicles, and it's extraordinarily costly unless you're willing for all those cars to come from China, which European governments aren't particularly willing to subsidize the purchase of said vehicles in order to incentivize like customers to buy them. And then if you look at some of the materials by which the modern world works, plastic, steel, concrete, they're all dependent for their production upon the use of fossil fuels, and there aren't alternatives to those at the moment, not at scale. Anyway, so there is a problem of contested politics and not taking climate change seriously enough in those countries that have got a vested interest in the fossil fuel energy regime, either fiscally or export wise. But that isn't a sufficient explanation about why the world collectively, in Europe in particular, hasn't got further with the energy transition.
I want to ask you about oil prices. They are still fluctuating, free floating. In the world where about 90% of oil is owned by state corporations, and all this money go, or almost all this money, all those petrodollars go to sovereign funds. So this is on the one hand, it is not really a free market because it's all owned by the states. On the other hand, oil prices fluctuate, and this changes have geopolitical significance. So what's your take on that? And what will be in the context of transition or energy revolution, as you said? What will be the role of low prices or high prices? The low prices destroyed the Soviet Union. There is the idea that low prices will also kind of help in the war nowadays with Ukraine, in Ukraine, and the American administration with very much concerned about keeping prices low. On the other hand, transition or revolution needs high prices and steadily growing prices so that people would buy less oil. So what is your take on all that?
I mean, I think that there's a set of really complex and interesting dynamics going on around oil prices in this respect. I mean, I used to say like sort of 5 years ago, maybe, certainly before the pandemic. The problem in world oil markets was that prices either were too low for producers, and you get the disasters from the point of view of a country like Venezuela, of what happened in 2014, like 15, which really goes into humanitarian crisis after the prices crash in the way in which they do. I think Iraq's story actually from 2014, including the rise of ISIS, there is somewhat tied to that as well. Or that they're too high for consumers, exhibit A of that being the 2008 crash. And I think the 2011 inflationary moment that led Trichet, when he was at the European Central Bank, to increase interest rates twice in response to those oil price increases in 2011, and did quite a lot of damage to the Eurozone in doing so. It's also the case that that period when prices went far too low for producers produced not just factor coordination between the old OPEC states, but this new producer alliance, which includes Russia, in its own OPEC. Plus, it's not obviously not just Russia, but Russia's obviously an important player in that. So one way of looking at what's gone on since the pandemic and after it is a tussle between OPEC Plus trying to put more on the price, particularly at any times of weak demand, and that pressure from Washington, as you said, Alexander, would be like they're not going much higher than 75 dollars a barrel before you've got a president in Washington trying to do like something about it. So we're kind of in a period in which there's a quite acute set of geopolitical tensions between Washington and OPEC Plus. And it's notable that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has not led to Washington being able to break OPEC Plus and separate Russia from Saudi Arabia away from each other. I think then the question becomes, well, what kind of scenario are we talking about in, say, 20 years' time, if we really are starting to see some significant progress on replacing oil with electricity? What kind of volume of production are we looking at? Now, I'm just going to put some figures. These are hypotheticals. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that in 20 years' time we've got it down to like 70. It's about 103, 104 million barrels a day. Let's just say, and this will be extraordinarily good progress if it was down to like 75 million. Let's say, like in 20 years' time. But you still got to ask, where's that 75 million barrels a day going to come from? It's not going to be coming any significant part of that from the United States. And with the shale boom is going to play itself out sometime over the next, probably less than a decade, probably namely like the early 2030s. It's possible in a world in which Iran has got a different kind of relations, maybe a different regime in Iran, that Iran's going to be a significantly bigger player than it is now, because all the geopolitical conflicts around Iran has kept its production lower than it would otherwise have been. Nonetheless, I think you're still going to bet on Saudi Arabia and Russia, being in that mix at about the levels they probably are now in that scenario. So in a way, the question with the energy transition in terms of replacing oil is who's going to be the last players standing in the oil market, and that a lot of that will depend on how long it takes for the electrification to replace oil. Now, one way of thinking about it, I think, which is slightly different to your question, but I think it brings something out, is to say it's a race between electrification, more rapid electrification, and the US shale oil boom playing out its cycle. Because there's not, as things stand, a replacement for shale oil providing 10 million barrels of oil a day. So even if we weren't talking about the climate change reasons for it, we still need, otherwise something else has got to come along. There's got to be equivalent of the offshore of the 80s. And from the geologists in the oil industry that I talk to, not lots of them, but the ones I have talked to, the most likely big bet left is Russian shale. If actually the world hasn't succeeded in stopping using 100 million barrels of oil a day, or got it down to in the 90s, and that's another that just raises another geopolitical problem.
How do you calculate this? So
that's part of the problem.
From the decarbonization programs like the New Green Deal, etc. So we know that by 2050, which is about 20 years from now, it should be net zero.
Yeah.
Net zero does mean zero pumping of oil. So say nowadays 7% of global oil goes into plastic and kind of synthetic things, which do not produce emissions. So this is non-emission oil. Okay.
Yeah.
So but then this net zero should roughly be equal to 7% of this non-emission oil. So that oil that doesn't produce emissions but goes into the stable and other good things. Is this your logic? But then you should get much lower numbers than this 75.
Yeah, well, I think that is a good part of the question, in that, or two things, that the truth of the matter is that nobody knows.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental epistemological difficulty that policymakers, I think, when they're being honest, they're like wrestling. They don't know what the answer to this question is. There's not enough technological certainty to know what progress, how rapid progress is going to be made, like on the electrification front. And then if you don't know what the answer to that is, it's quite difficult also to think about the oil problem, because you don't know whether you're going to run into, if you've not made good progress, whether you're going to run into what do we do about the risk of very high oil prices from insufficient cheap supply. Again, and it's complicated, as you said, Alexander, by the fact then that actually the energy transition itself, particularly electric vehicles, are quite heavy consumers of petrochemicals. So you can see this in China's data, I think, quite clearly, is that the gains in getting electric vehicles on the road don't necessarily translate into the same volume of reduction for oil consumption, because the petrochemical consumption is going to carry going on like on an upward trajectory. Now, you might not worry about that for emissions reasons, but you still got to worry about it for oil reasons.
Since you worked on and you are working on Russia and Germany, and Ukraine is the transit country for this oil and gas that is traded. So we see here, a true puzzle that during the war, the gas exports, they keep going through Ukraine, and Ukraine is kind of the last news is that Ukraine promised to stop it by the next year, by 1st of January, but there are all kinds of doubts and debates about that. So what is your explanation? Do you have a geopolitical explanation for this economic transaction, which is truly very unusual during the war?
I mean, I think that you can't underestimate the role that transit through Ukraine played in Russian-Ukraine relations from the moment that Ukraine had its independence, like in 1991. I mean, even more than Sevastopol, I'd say, because there was an agreement about Sevastopol, obviously, in 1997, is that there was just a whole succession of crises in Russian-Ukraine relations, at the center of which is the pipelines. And over some of those issues, I must admit, I don't think it's too difficult to have some sympathy for the Russian position in terms of Ukraine's unwillingness to modernize, making the difficulties that Ukraine government posed to modernizing these pipelines. And it's also very clear, if you go back to the middle of the last decade, that Putin had as a strategic objective eliminating all transit through Ukraine where gas is concerned. He made major concessions from his point of view to Merkel in December of 2019 when he agreed that agreement that comes to an end, I think, at the beginning of 2025. He didn't want to do that, and Ukraine was begging for the transit to continue because of the fees that it receives from transit. I think it's an interesting question as to why Putin, the Russian leadership, did not inflict economic damage on Ukraine by closing down transit during the war. And it's notable that when it did move to close transit, it reduced the supply through Nord Stream 1 before the explosions. Now, you might say the answer is, and is because actually the way that I've been presenting it so far is just as a kind of like state to state relation. And actually, there's a whole set of shared corporate oligarchic interests that overlap between Russia and Ukraine around the pipelines, and they can't really think about the issue without bringing that into it. But I would be quite surprised if, from the Ukrainian government's point of view, do they really want to take a hit in terms of losing the economic piece. That would be a radical change from any position that Ukraine's had.
More questions? I want to ask, hopefully, at least my last question, but it would be about Russia and China. So, we know the data about the growing import of oil by China and India, and that all goes across, across the world, but it starts from the Baltic ports, and then it goes to other states, which are very easy to control for Denmark, for Sweden, for European Union. Like from the military point of view, nothing could be easier than just to stop the strait. On the other hand, the exports of China to Russia are growing hugely. Plus, I mean, like 1,000% or something a year for vehicles that Russia buys from China, basically in exchange for this oil. And so there are two, I think, questions here. One question is like, why, basically, again, during the war, why Europe and the world basically tolerates this production? Because it's obviously, finances the war and makes it much more long and worse. But another question is kind of, I think, more interesting, that like when the Siberian oil went to Germany through Central Russia, through this Druzhba pipeline, through Ukraine, so that sort of that trade was really kind of that was the political economic foundation for the existence of Russian Federation. Oil went, the most important commodity, the backbone of the political economy, went from Siberia to Europe, basically through Russia or through Petersburg. But if it now goes from Siberia to China, okay, now it goes through the Baltic, so still through Petersburg, but basically, what would be the geopolitical reason for having Moscow as the capital of Russia, for having all these, huge spaces that would not be involved? If to imagine in 20 years from now, a direct trade between Siberia and China, why Central Russia, like what would be the role of Central Russia, therefore of Moscow, therefore of Russia, the Russian Federation in this construction?
I think that is a really important question, and it gets to the heart of the kind of power that Russia has been, and the way in which in a way in which the Soviet Union worked too, because if you think about both the Soviet state and the Russian state, that they've been, at least into the last, say, 5 years in Russia, more Western orientation than Eastern orientation. And that matters if you are the only Eurasian state in the world, which way that you go. And if we think of the fact that the Soviet and Khrushchev states and Khrushchev onwards had to find a way to have sufficient export earnings from its energy, essentially to be able to feed the Soviet population. That's the kind of trade that the Soviet made. And you can see that quite clearly by the time that you get to like the 70s. It had to go west rather than east, because China was too underdeveloped in modern terms. That didn't mean that Russia or the Soviets weren't interested in China's resources. They were actually interested in China's rare earths back in the 1920s. I mean, you can actually say, I think that that's partly why the Soviet Union sort of sponsored the Chinese like Communist Party. I mean, it's not the only reason, like obviously, but that was part of the deal, but that did not deliver. So if now Russia has a crisis of its relations with Europe, and that so far as it can continue to sell oil and gas to European countries, it's either by sea or indirectly, like through petroleum products, and that its bigger primary market has got to be China. You cannot have, I think, the same Russian state as you have, and that's, I think, what you were like getting at. And then the fact that Siberia is this energy resource center of Russia, and China has got unresolved territorial claims going back to that breakup of China, effectively, when the British, after the British opened, after the first Opium War. That means that Siberia comes in play, I think, as a site of geopolitical tension. Having said that, China has still got a problem because for all its energy transition advantages, it's still got a foreign oil and gas dependency problem, with opportunities for the United States in any military conflict with China to disrupt its supply. And that, I think, so long as China has that problem, then I think that territorial claims and trying to control Siberia is going to be second to that. Now, you might say, in time, real problems on the first is going to incentivize trying to move on Siberia, yes, but it's not going to come before China's dealt with its Taiwan issue. Or I'd be very surprised if it did anyway.
Anything else? We will cover the planet, the final planet, but still, that was a lot. Thank you so much. So there's wine and snacks to the left or to the right?